Good afternoon, everyone. This is again a webinar organized by the Global Shelter Cluster. Today, with special guest, we have Marina Peter. She is going to explain us about drinking water supply technologies, covering all stages of water supply chain from the water sources to the consumer. It will introduce the new compendium of the drinking water, which will be published very soon. I give the floor to Marina, and thank you very much, Marina, to join us.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining. I'm happy to be able to introduce the drinking water supply treatment systems with the focus on humanitarian context, but I will talk also more generally about water and health, water supply standards and requirements mentioned in the Sphere standard, as well as the Sustainable Development Goal 6. Talk a little bit more in detail about water supply treatment and technologies, and I hope I will be able to provide you some links and possibilities to go more into detail if you like, to focus on certain topic. And at the very end, we will also talk about the water safety management and basically water safety plans as a way of managing the systems and safety of the systems on a long term. So maybe let's start first with a short reminder, which I think most of you know, about how important the access to safe water is. What you see on the graph here is basically the access of population with access to safe water to the correlated with deaths of infants of less than 1 year of the age. And what we see here is that it correlates really very strongly. So the lower access to safe water is, the higher infant mortality is, especially going to the 15 or 20% in some cases. So which shows us how important the water supply and safety of water is, but also that it is specifically important for small children because they're affected even more than adults are. So when we think about that, I mean, what kind of water and sanitation related diseases do we know? And there are just basically four.
Andrea, you're speaking fast now.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Sorry.
There are major 4 groups of different water-related diseases. So this is so-called water-borne diseases. These are the diseases transmitted by water directly. You might know cholera, typhoid, hepatitis, giardiasis. This might be the infections of diseases you already heard about. Then we have also diseases which are caused by lack of water. This kind of diseases are called so-called water wash diseases. So water wash diseases are, for example, skin sepsis or trachoma, which affects eyes and are more related to hygiene than to safety of water, but also to safety of water since it is used for hygiene measures. The third group of diseases we know are the so-called water-based diseases. I think one of the important examples is schistosomiasis, which has a very complicated cycle, basically going from pathogens living on snails, going to the person, to the body of the person, basically changing from different organs of the person, and then being excreted again into the environment. The fourth type of disease is so-called water-related insect vector diseases, which you might know malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, so which are transmitted with so-called vectors, which are basically insects, which live in water bodies and multiply there and then can spread the diseases. So this is the basically general water and sanitation related diseases. And if you think about more waterborne diseases, which are directly transmitted through water or safe or unsafe actually water supply systems or lack of water supply. So then I would like to show you a short video which explains different types of pathogens which are found in water bodies. So I'll quickly stop here and
On the chat, you will see the link.
Can you see now the video?
Yes.
Yes, so I started, and then I hope there should be the Arabic subtitle.
There are hundreds maybe thousands of
Yeah, we
organisms
can hear.
cause waterborne diseases. One useful way to classify these pathogens is by biological type. In this module, we'll briefly talk about 4 different classes of pathogens. The most important ones are the protozoa, bacteria, and viruses, but we'll also give an example of one helminth, or parasitic worm, which is transmitted through drinking water. The first thing to note about pathogens is that they are small. A human hair is about 0.1 millimeters, or 100 microns, in diameter. Protozoa, the largest class of pathogens, are much smaller, usually about 10 to 50 microns in size. Protozoa are one-celled eukaryotes. That means that their cell has a nucleus, unlike prokaryotic cells, such as bacteria. Some protozoa can form an egg-like cyst to survive harsh conditions, such as exposure to extreme temperature, chemicals, or long periods without water or food. Many protozoa are parasites and cause diseases like malaria and giardia. Here you see Entamoeba histolytica and Cryptosporidium parvum, both of which can cause severe diarrhea. Entamoeba is the cause of amoebic dysentery, or bloody diarrhea. This disease affects adults more than children, and only about 10 to 20% of those infected with entamoeba develop symptoms. It is estimated to cause more than 100,000 deaths per year. Recent studies have shown that Cryptosporidium, commonly called crypto, is one of the leading causes of diarrheal disease among children. A large and important research project, the Global Enteric Multicenter Study, or GEMS, has found it to be the second most commonly isolated pathogen among children with diarrhea, after rotavirus. Cryptosporidium forms cysts which are about 5 microns in diameter and are highly resistant to treatment. The first human cases of crypto were reported in 1976, and the disease became infamous in 1993 when an outbreak occurred in the northern U.S. city of Milwaukee. Cryptosporidium overwhelmed the treatment plant's filtration system, and chlorine has no effect on crypto. Over 2 weeks, 400,000 people became ill, and over 100 deaths were caused, mainly in people with compromised immune systems. Cryptosporidium is a major cause of death among people with HIV/AIDS. The infectious dose for Cryptosporidium and other protozoa is low. Even a single cyst can cause disease. Bacteria are organisms a few microns in size and of varying shapes, such as spheres, rods, or spirals. They are prokaryotes, which means that, unlike the protozoa, they do not contain a nucleus. Bacteria are everywhere, growing in soil, in the deep ocean, and even in acidic hot springs. A gram of soil or a milliliter of water can contain several million bacterial cells. Although the vast majority of bacteria are harmless or even beneficial to humans, a few can cause diseases, such as cholera, trachoma, or salmonella. Here you see the E. coli and Vibrio Cholera bacteria. They, like most bacteria, are about 1 or 2 microns in size. E. coli is universally found in human and animal feces, but is normally not pathogenic. In fact, E. coli is the preferred indicator bacteria used to demonstrate fecal contamination. However, some strains of E. coli do cause disease. These are called pathogenic E. coli. And one group of these pathogens is the Enterotoxigenic E. coli, or ETEC. The GEMS project found ETEC to be among the top 5 pathogens isolated from children with diarrhea and affects particularly small infants. The other bacterial pathogen most commonly found by GEMS was Shigella, a distant relative of E. coli. Together, Shigella and E. coli are thought to cause up to 1/3 of the diarrheal disease mortality globally. Vibrio cholera causes the terrifying disease cholera. It can spread very rapidly under the right conditions and can cause severe diarrhea and death within hours if not treated. Cholera thrives in conditions where there is crowding and poor sanitation and hygiene. Outbreaks can occur after natural disasters, in refugee camps, and in peri-urban slums. There are an estimated 3 to 5 million cholera cases and 100,000 to 120,000 deaths due to cholera every year. The smallest of the pathogens are the viruses, which are typically 0.1 microns, that's the same as 100 nanometers, or even smaller in diameter. Viruses don't have an independent metabolism. They can only grow or reproduce within a living host cell and cannot multiply within the environment. Many viruses are host-specific, causing disease in humans or specific animals only. Rotaviruses and hepatitis A and E viruses are the most widespread waterborne viruses affecting humans. Here you see rotavirus at about 75 nanometers and hepatitis E, which is quite small, at about 30 nanometers. You could line up thousands of hepatitis E viruses and still be smaller than a human hair. Rotavirus is one of the main pathogens causing diarrheal disease. The GEMS project found rotavirus to be the single most commonly isolated pathogen among children with diarrheal disease. It is particularly prevalent among the youngest children. Infected people shed large numbers of the virus in their feces, approximately 10 to the 11 viruses per gram of fecal matter. That's 100,000 of millions. The viruses are highly infective. Only 10 to 100 virus particles are needed to cause infection. Rotavirus was estimated to cause over 500,000 deaths each year in 2004, with more than 85% of these deaths occurring in low-income countries in Africa and Asia. Hepatitis A is spread through food, water, or direct contact with infected people. Hepatitis E is mainly spread through drinking water. Both diseases are widespread in the developing world. In countries with poor sanitation and hygiene, nearly all children are infected before the age of 10. Every year there are over 3 million acute cases of hepatitis E and over 50,000 deaths related to hepatitis E. Finally, although it is nearly eradicated, polio remains an important waterborne virus. There were only 223 cases reported in 2012, down from some 350,000 cases in 1988. Only 3 countries remain polio endemic: Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Pakistan. But as long as a single child remains infected, children in all countries are at risk. Water, sanitation, and hygiene play an important role in eliminating polio. From the smallest of pathogens to the largest, the helminths, or parasitic worms, which can invade human intestines or other tissues. Most helminth transmission is due to poor sanitation and hygiene, but one particularly nasty helminth is mainly transmitted through drinking water. This is Dracunculus merinensis, or guinea worm. Its larvae live in fresh water and are eaten by small aquatic insects called copepods. The larvae are tiny, but the copepods are big, typically about 1 millimeter, and visible to the naked eye. Once a person drinks water containing the copepods, hydrochloric acid in the stomach kills the insect and releases the larvae, which mature and grow into adult worms. These can reach a length of nearly a meter and be as wide as a spaghetti noodle. The worms migrate through the body and emerge through the skin, often near the feet. The worm has to be removed slowly, winding it up and pulling it out of the body bit by bit over weeks. This is extremely painful. It creates sores and blisters, and people often soak their feet in water to relieve the pain. The worm then discharges hundreds of thousands of larvae into the water, completing the transmission cycle. Major progress has been made towards eliminating guinea worm. Since 1986, a global eradication campaign has been led by the Carter Center in close collaboration with WHO, the CDC, and UNICEF.
So that was a video showing how the different types of pathogens exist and what kind of diseases they can cause, which are basically focusing on the waterborne diseases. So what you see now on the screen is basically an F diagram, and we discussed this last time when we talked about sanitation. So kind of just trying to remember basically that usually most of the pathogens are being transmitted from feces, and they're found in human feces. They can be transmitted through fluids, fingers, flies, and fields, basically agriculture products, to food, or directly by drinking water through a new host. And last time we discussed about the sanitation, which is basically the first major barrier, while drinking water treatment and safe drinking water supply is a barrier which here is marked as blue. So transmitted basically the diseases from fluids to a new host or to food through food. The rest, what you see here, is more related to hygiene, which we're not going to talk too much today. So when we think about water supply, then one of the first things we have to think about is basically the standards for water supply and water quality, which is there. And in humanitarian context, we often think of the sphere minimal standards, so which define basically the water quantity and the water quality. I think one of the important statements in sphere is that providing high volume of water with reasonable quantity should be preferred to small volume of water with very high quality of water. But still the focus is that we don't provide just any kind of water, and the water quality is important to assure that the people don't get sick through water. So the minimal standards for sphere, I mean, you might know that, or you might find it in the publication here, the sphere handbook, which is the link, you find it below. So it's basically that for survival needs, water intake or drinking and food, it's only about 2.5 to 3 liters of water. For hygiene practices, up to 6 liters. We need some water for basic cooking, between 3 and 6 liters. And total basic water resulting to 7.5 to 15. So basically, CR state is a minimum of 15 liters per person per day should be provided. So, and this should be adapted to local cultural context as well as the climate and conditions. So if you think also about other key indicators, it's not just the quality of water, its amount, but it's also the way how accessible the water is. So if you're thinking about basic water facility, then we know that it should be not more than 250 people per tap or 400 people for open hand well to be able to get sufficient amount of water in a reasonable period of time. The water might not necessarily be for free, so it's fine to ask for price for water if the context and conditions allow that, but the target price should be 5 cents or less. So the distance from any household to nearest water point should be kept under 500 meters and the queuing time less than 30 minutes. So basically the other indicators define how do you actually measure the standards are being in place or not. For example, you can look at the percentage of water systems and facilities that have functional accountable management system in place, because if they not, there's an issue with sustainability about that. If you look on the water quality, then we also have to think that the water systems which are
I'm sorry, Marina, you're speaking fast again. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm registered again. Thank you.
Thank you.
So for water quality, we are thinking about the percentage of people who collect drinking water from protected water sources, which means that we have to count people who use protected or unprotected water sources. So, and there are also definitions for that, but I'm not going much into detail. So the possibility of households for storing water in safely and clean and covered containers at all times. So basically availability of water at household. As well as there is possibility for water quality measurements, then the sphere defines that the water quality for unchlorinated water should be less than 10 CFU per 100 milliliter for point of delivery. So while if there is a chlorination, water is chlorinated, that what's possible or easier to measure is the chlorine residual, which should be between 0.2 and 0.5 milligram per liter of the free chlorine. So consider the turbidity is less than 5 NU. So the sphere standards are important, but we have to think that it's really called minimal standards. And if you're thinking more about the recovery or stabilization recovery phases of the emergencies, then we should think also of long-term goals. And the long-term goals are defined by sustainable development goals, and specifically target 6.1, which is the target for drinking water. The Sustainable Development Goals define that by 2030, which is not so long time left anymore, we aim to achieve the universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. So, and the key indicator is basically population use and safely managed drinking water services. So you remember the key indicators for sphere were a little bit different. So still this safely managed drinking water service has a lot of similar issues hidden inside. For example, the accessibility of water, availability when it's needed, as well as the water quality, which are major indicators of sustainable development goals. Also, when we're thinking of sustainable development goals, we don't think about just one typical goal to reach. So like usually like before, you know, we can think of having like for minimal standard 15 liters of water of the reasonable quality. Here, what we think about is a drinking water ladder, which means there are different levels you could reach for providing water quality and water quantity. So there are basically improved and unimproved systems. And for unimproved systems, which means this is the systems which are using unprotected duct wells or unprotected springs, or this is also surface water. This is the last two. While for drinking water, which is kind of accessible, there are three different levels. So limited level, basic, and safely managed. And for limited, we think of an improved water source, but which is far away and which collection time exceeds 30 minutes for a round trip, including queuing. For basic type of services, we think of water from an improved source, but then the collection time is less than 30 minutes, while safely managed systems, which is kind of should be the final goal for everybody, is the drinking water from an improved water source, which is located on premises, available when needed, and free from fecal and priority chemical contamination. So, and accessibility is, again, we see here the 30 minutes. You remember in Sphere, we also had about the 30 minutes of queuing time. Here it's really 30 minutes, including the travel and queuing time. So when we think about availability when needed, we talk about continuity, sufficiency of water. So the question is here will be to ask if you get the collected data in the last month, like your household did not have sufficient quantity of water. So how many days did it not have it? Or we also think about the water quality, which means that the water should be free of threats to human health. In this case, the level of E. coli is defined as the 0 CFU per 100 milliliter, as well as the water should be free of also priority chemicals, for example, arsenic or fluoride. And the data to collect this is available normally through household surveys and census and other sector data, which is there. So while we know what are the standards and what we should reach, I think it's important to look on how can we get this and can we reach those standards. And the first thing we usually do is to look on the water cycle. So water cycle defines as what kind of water sources are available in the places. Also, sometimes we use to certain communities using certain water sources and socially, culturally acceptable. But sometimes when there are limitations or needs, it's also worth of looking what other water sources are available if they're there. So typical water sources from our side, this is the rainwater, this is the different surface water, for example, like lakes, dams, and streams. So groundwater, which is very much related to the surface water and rainwater. So, and saline water from oceans or seas, which also can be sometimes the only water source in some areas. So if you think now of the how this water cycle related to kind of water supply systems, then let's maybe take a look at this graph and then think of the standard centralized water treatment system, which we'll find in many places. So usually there will be a water source. Let's say this is a surface water source available. There should be some kind of system where the water is being taken. So this is the intake system, we called it. The water is abstracted. For example, there is a pumping station. Then it's delivered to a treatment plant where it's being treated from pollutants, for example, turbidity of particles in water, organic matter, and bacterial contamination. So it's been distributed through distribution system and then delivered finally to households through private tap. If you look now on more rural water supply system, then we also would have a source. For example, it can be groundwater, which can be deep or shallow. So the water is also being taken through an intake system. In our case, in rural system, that can be a well, right? A deep well, a borehole, or duct well. So there's some abstraction system, which in our case, this is a pumping system. The water is also being distributed or transported, but this time, these are people who carry water with the jerry can at home. And in the end, at the user level, we have to think of safety at the user, for example, through water storage containers or household water treatment, which is happening on the safety level. So if you see here, this is an example of 3 completely different type of systems, but they're all related in the ways that all of them have a source, have an intake structure, have some kind of abstraction technology behind it, a treatment system. Sometimes they have, sometimes we can go over that level. There is a distribution, which can be a standard distribution system in place, or just simple transport of water manually with a jerry can. And in the end, we have the use. So these are the 6 categories, or we call it 6 functional groups, which build the basis for structuring the whole water supply from source to consumer in one single document, which we call the compendium for drinking water systems and technologies. This compendium is built very similar to sanitation compendium, which I presented last time, and has a similar background behind it. So there will be 2 publications coming up by the end of 2020. So one is a general compendium for drinking water, which is focusing more development context and also has some long-term solutions in it. While compendium of water supply technologies and emergencies is focusing specifically on emergency context from acute phase, stabilization phase, and recovery phases of that. So there is some overlap of both documents, but they're 2 independent publications. The first document has been developed by us at the University of Applied Sciences in Arles, Northwestern Switzerland, together with ELRHA and World Health Organization, while the emergency compendium is developed by German WASH Network and Global WASH Cluster, together also with our help. So I mentioned these 6 different functional groups, and that's the way how the compendium system templates look like. So you see here the overview of the all different type of technologies. And since you see this is the 6 different functional groups, you can also build systems by combining technologies from these functional groups, the same way we did it in sanitation compendium. Here I'll just bring an example I showed before about the centralized water supply system. Right, so we see here, we can combine the rivers, water from river and streams, so pond or lakes or dams. So this is all kind of surface water sources available there. They can be abstracted through river or lake intake systems, delivered by gravity or using the mechanical velocity pumps, for example. So to the treatment plant, being treated from turbidity and microbial contamination of water, considering there is no chemical contamination issues with this water, delivered through large-scale distribution system, and finally delivered to households where it's being stored because, for example, water supply system is intermittent. Another example will be more something to find in hilly or mountain areas where we have natural springs. In this case, the water from a spring will be taken to a protected spring intake, delivered by gravity, maybe treated if it's necessary, maybe not. So to a water kiosk, for example, or a small community distribution system. And from there on, it will be either delivered to household where it's been stored, if the water quality is good, or it has to be treated at household level. So these were the examples of so-called system templates. And generally in the compendium, we describe 9 system templates. So I just showed some of the examples of them. But of course, the book is not limited to these 9 systems. So if you have a specific context and you know your conditions and you would like to develop a system, you can use this graphic or this figure yourself to draw the system according to your conditions. For example, here I bring an example just beyond those 9 about the good water quality groundwater, which we want to combine with a solar pumping. In this case, your source will be a good quality groundwater, most probably deep groundwater sources. It can be extracted through a protected borehole. It is delivered with through deep well pumps with the solar energy, which have been used by solar energy. It might have to be chlorinated before it enters the community distribution system to bring some residual chlorine into the system. And finally, it's being stored at the safe water storage containers in households. So you can draw these kind of examples as you like, as you would like to structure or think of different options for your typical solution or your typical system. So to be able to orient a little bit in the compendium, we have the 6 functional groups, and in these functional groups, the introductory chapter explains a little bit what kind of background information, what actually this functional group means, what are the criteria, for example, for selecting a water source or for selecting certain technology you have to take into consideration. And if you look on the single sheets, then each sheet is structured in a way that we have a drawing or schematic presentation of one of the options of possible technology. Then we have operational issues and functionality described of this technology to understand it. We think about applicability and adequacy. For example, what kind of emergency context the system can be used if you talk about emergency compendium. There is operation maintenance requirements, as well as materials required for constructing of the certain technology, and advantages and disadvantages of each sheet. Finally, we talk about the health and environmental aspects, as well as social considerations related to that. And in the end of each sheet, there is some kind of additional information, additional reading information provided if you would like to get more information. The compendium is not meant as a guidance to build systems, because it's just very simple and very concise, but it's meant to give you an overview if you're not very much familiar with all different technologies, to be able to make decisions what kind of technologies or what kind of combination of technologies which might make sense for your context to design or to plan water supply system, or to be able to rehabilitate the systems which are there in place. Finally, in the end of at the beginning of each sheet, we have this short summary of management level, availability of technologies and components locally, so as well as the technology maturity level, because some of the technologies might be established, and some of them just maybe something new developments which are not there at place at the scale. Also, if you're thinking about the selecting technologies, it's not just about technology itself, but we also have to think about different user preferences and needs and the problem awareness, water quantity as immediate capacity, but also capacity and availability over time. So especially in an acute phase of emergency, the solutions over time might not be in a priority. For example, we can think about the water tracking, maybe the only options in the beginning, but on a long term, we might think about the availability over time and considering establishing of the other technologies to provide the sustainability. The water quality, which might be the present water quality, but also the possible risk of contamination of the water. While the groundwater sources, the shallow groundwater, might be safe at the beginning, if there is a huge refugee camp being set on top of it, then we know that the risk of contamination will be high. So we have to think of the treatment, even if the water quality at the beginning might be still fine. The other point we have to think about is the technology required for exploitation of this technology, so to put it in use, but also to operate and maintain it on the long term, as well as environmental and health impact of this technology. For example, if there is waste streams being generated, so what is the resilience of these technologies, for example, to problems related to climate change or any other specific dangers which might come from the area. And finally, as we discussed it already in sanitation module, the enabling environment is extremely important for selecting any kind of technologies, because in this case, we talk about the government support, legal frameworks, institutional arrangements, skills and capacities which are there, all kind of financial arrangements which are in place, as well as social cultural acceptance. So all factors which affect the enabling environment, or in some cases it can be disabling environment, which will not let us implement long-term solutions, sustainable solutions which are in place because of missing links of this enabling environment. So now let's take a look on each, very shortly in each technology functional group. So, and mention major components and major technologies which have been mentioned there. So I'm not going to go much into details because simply we don't have time for this module. But if you like to know more about each of this technology, then please consult the compendium as well as the course, the this massive online open course on public health engineering, and the link of that I will share in the end, which goes into the more detail for each functional group and each technology mentioned in the functional group. So coming back to water sources, I mean, that's a topic which might be most familiar to you. So what we're describing here is basically availability of surface and rainwater. So while knowing if we try to use the surface water as our major water supply, then we always have to think about the treatment of water, because water quality might not be an issue, or might be a big issue, while the accessibility of water might be easier. But of course it's difficult. It has every kind of system has to be taken into consider in this context. The other major group of water sources is basically groundwaters, where we think of springs, different groundwater which is there, which can be accessible also with different types of technologies. And the type of the groundwater finally will define also what kind of other technologies we are going to use or we can use for that. For brackish and seawater, normally we don't see that as the water source, but sometimes we can be in the situation where there's basically no other sources available. And usually it's much easier to treat any kind of other water source and desalinate water. So we always have to think to find another source when it's available. But if not, the compendium also discusses some of the technologies available now for the saltwater or brackish water desalination. Now changing to the intake structures, again, the intakes are specific to the type of the water sources you use. So if you think about surface water intakes, it might be very simple unprotected systems we can find on the lake shores or river shores, or protected intakes on the streams which are likely to carry boulders or debris. So another technologies which are being discussed, for example, is the river bank filtration. So possibility of pre-filtering water using the soil if it's permeable. So basically an abstracting water on a certain distance from the river. For the groundwater intakes, the compendium basically discusses two major types of technologies, which is the duck wells, the different types of duck wells available, or boreholes. So as well as looking at the spring or protected spring intakes. So for any kind of well, we have to consider that there should be some kind of a concrete seal to protect from contaminants. There should be some kind of system which is basically cause a casing of the well, also to either if it's duct well to protect it from collapsing, and if it's the borehole basically to give a structure to a borehole. So it also kind of supports the infiltrate or protects the well from infiltration of contaminants from the surface levels. Finally, for example, for borehole, steel or PVC pipes are normally used for lining the well walls, and the well screen holds back the sediments, but not water from entering the well. So of course, if you use the PVC pipes, for example, for lining, this can be slit to create fine cuts, acting as a barrier for sediments. You see here below. Sometimes the gravel pack is used if the soil particles are much smaller and than the sizes of the hole of the screen, so to protect particles going into the water. So basically, this is kind of the typical structure, but there's of course all kind of different wells, and the way how wells are being built depends also on the type of technology which is being used. So if you think about the duck wells, then the diameter is relatively big and the depths might not overcome more than 30 meters. But then there are different ways of drilling or jetting wells, so which provides you here in this table information how deep you can go, what kind of possibilities is there. It's nice to have the overview to define what's locally available and what sources are there to be able to build wells, especially deep wells, to reach the deep groundwater. So if we're thinking of the abstraction technologies, basically we think of gravity water supply systems or pumps. So there are different types of pumps. There is a huge amount of pumps, actually, depending also on context and countries being used. So we can think of the manual pumps generally, which are powered by human power, or also manual power pumps, the so-called hydropower pumps. So while most commonly used are the motorized pumps, which can be piloted by electricity, diesel, solar, or wind power, depend on the conditions you are there. And we can also structure the pumps by different operational principle. So there are the impulse pumps, positive displacement pumps, which are those which you might know more from a hand pump, the way how it functions. So, but it also can be operated, of course, mechanically with motorized pumping, or so-called velocity pumps. So in Compendium, we also have the overview of the different pumping systems, as well as the advantages or disadvantages of each of them, as well as the different energy sources which can be used for pumping. Of course, if there's a possibility of using gravity, this is usually the simplest and the easiest way of delivering water. So, but this is usually possible only in hilly areas where there are, for example, natural spring or water reservoirs already in place. So, but other typical ways of delivering pumping water is using the diesel generators or power supply from a grid, which are available. And now there is more and more attempts also in humanitarian sector.
Dre, can you hear me?
And so I would like now to shortly mention the Global Solar Water Initiative. And the Global Solar Water Initiative basically promotes the solar water supply or solar water pumping specifically for refugee settings. So I would like to show this little bit advertisement video developed by Oxfam. And there is also a link to the homepage from the Oxfam where there's more information about the Global Solar Water Initiative.
The average lifespan of a refugee camp is about 20 years.
Still the same, actually.
Right services for people.
But I'll try. I'll try. I'll see what I can do. I'll try my best.
Yes, so I'll try to make it louder. Maybe it helps as well. So yeah.
But also robust and long-lasting. Research has shown that for off-grid areas, solar energy is the cheapest and most reliable solution for pumping and supplying water. However, it is still not being widely adopted for humanitarian responses. The Global Solar and Water Initiative, formed by IOM, Oxfam and NRC, with funding from ECHO, addresses this. Since 2016, we have visited 55 camps and communities, conducted training workshops in 8 countries, and addressed technical queries from 80 organizations across 5 continents. This has built the technical capacity of decision makers and engineers in government and humanitarian organizations, increasing their understanding of solar pumping. And along the way, debunking some myths about solar. By analyzing 140 different water schemes, we found that switching to solar will pay for itself within 4 years, and in some circumstances, solar is cheaper than a diesel generator from day one. Over the lifetime of these systems, solar will be 40 to 90% cheaper. Where negative experiences with solar were found, they were unrelated to the solar technology itself. Accelerating adoption of solar will save millions of dollars every year and provide a more reliable access to water at lower cost. The Global Solar Water Initiative would like governments and organizations planning and implementing water supply projects to adopt solar technology as a default first choice option anywhere where grid electricity is unreliable, while raising awareness among their staff of performance and financial benefits of solar compared to other power options. And additionally, to recognise that solar technology can be appropriate during the first phase of an emergency. There is no need to delay introducing these cost-effective and sustainable solutions. More information on the Global Solar Water Initiative.
So I hope you were able still to see, and I hope that the subtitles I put on helped a little bit the translation. So, I mean, just generally to repeat, there's a lot of opportunities around solar technologies and at the moment for solar pumping, so which can replace the diesel generators, but also other ways of delivering water which might have been established because of the in acute concept, for example, something like tracking water with the tracking with water tracking, so which in the end can be very expensive and not really a very sustainable options. So in these cases, the solar water pumping can be considered, and at the homepage which has been shared at the video, you can find more information as well as training materials on this technology. So going further on to the drinking water treatment technologies, basically we have to think of different types of technologies available, but all of them can be structured around 4 major reasons. So one is the particle removal, which is usually used for surface water sources, but not only. So which focuses, or which is around the technologies, for example, like coagulation, sedimentation, rough infiltration, or rapid sun filtration, which goal is to reduce the turbidity of water. So it is possible to disinfect this water or, with chlorine, or remove the microbial contaminants in another way. So, and besides chlorination, which is typically used in humanitarian context, because the chlorination can provide a residual protection for water, there are also other means which can be explored, especially if the acceptance of chlorine in a communities are low. This can be, for example, UV, slow sun filtration, membrane-based systems, for example, ultrafiltration, or also thermal technologies like pasteurization. If our source water are saline or brackish water, then we have to think of desalination technologies. And in this case, most commonly reverse osmosis is being used now. So while if you're considering the areas which are strongly affected by geogenic or anthropogenic chemicals, so as in surface or groundwater, then some post-treatment is required. For example, like adsorption on granule activated carbon, using also membrane technologies, ozonation, or a combination of processes to be able to reduce the geogenic anthropogenic chemicals. Well, in some cases, at the very beginning, in the acute phase of the emergencies, that might be not important to consider that on short term. On the long term, we have to consider of the long-term effects this geogenic, anthropogenic chemicals might have, and these effects can be also severe. I will also share later on the homepage from the groundwater monitoring, which basically provides you possibility to kind of a risk, to find out what risks are for geogenic chemicals like arsenic or fluoride in your own areas. So this are maps based on the geological conditions, so and certain risk calculations for specific context. So I think chlorination is one of the most typical technologies used. And while speaking about chlorination, we just need to think that chlorination is very efficient for removal of bacteria. It's a little bit less efficient, but still efficient for removal of viruses. And the chlorination might be completely inefficient for removal of protozoa. So while we're using filtration techniques before, might be still a lot of protozoa being removed by that, but if the chlorination is used directly, and as we heard in the very beginning, protozoa, for example, Cryptosporidium, is a big problem, and especially problem for small children, then in certain conditions, the chlorination might not reach the effect we want to reach in the end, if this Cryptosporidium, for example, is a problem and one of the major causes of disease in the area. So here what you see on the graph is basically concentration and time which required to achieve a 99% removal of this bacteria, viruses, protozoas. And then you see that in this case, for protozoa, the time and concentration should be very much higher comparison to bacteria and viruses. But also for viruses, we have to consider that, for example, a certain minute waiting time really has to be assured to be able to disinfect viruses, while some of the bacteria will be gone within with a relatively short period of time in the beginning. If you think also of chlorination systems, there are different types of chlorination options you can use. And I think the most probable systems you know is the calcium hypochlorite, which is used for rather small scale systems or also large scale systems, or for really large scale city installations. This is a chlorine gas, which has been used directly in the water supply system. So, as well as the sodium hypochlorite, and then calcium hypochlorite is more the so-called solid hypochlorite or solid chlorine, which has been used as a powder, which is more expensive comparison to sodium hypochlorite, the liquid one, or the chlorine gas, but still is used because it's easier to transport and to store it. What I would like to draw your attention here is so-called on-site hypochlorite production. And this on-site hypochlorite production is It's relatively new technologies, but not very new, coming now more and more. So which exists in two types of systems. It's basically a batch system for on-site chlorination. This is an example of one Swiss producer delivering different types of systems. It's also systems used by Swiss humanitarian aid a lot, I think. So which are basically generating active chlorine at the batch scale. So you build up, like you use a saline solution, and then from the saline solution it's been converted to chlorine, which can be dosed afterwards manually or automatically with the pump to a water supply system. There are also continuous on-site chlorination systems, which are a little bit more complex, but they're designed to replace chlorine gas systems, especially in the conditions where there is a high risk that the chlorine gas system cannot be used further on, for example, in the conflict conditions, because there is a risk of bombing on the chlorine gas storage or chlorine gas being stolen for other needs or for other uses, for example, as chemical weapon or so on. So when there is this kind of risk of misuse, then it might be on long term, might be a good idea to transfer from chlorine gas systems to another chlorine systems, and continuous on-site chlorination might become more and more important in time. The other options which are there is a membrane-based systems, and we know about different membrane systems basically, which are different depending on the size of the membrane, the size of the pores, and the pressure which is required to press the water through the membrane. So the membrane, you can imagine yourself being just a filter, so basically like a filter paper, so which is made out of plastic, and the pores are a defined size. For the microfiltration, we can remove most of the clay particles and some bacteria, but ultrafiltration systems will also remove viruses and basically provide water which is bacterial microbial free of microbial contamination. If you have an issue with priority chemicals, the nanofiltration might be useful. And if you need to remove the salt from water, which is extremely small, salt particles, then we have to think about the reverse osmosis. And as you see here, from microfiltration to reverse osmosis, the pressure required is increasing a lot. Not sure you actually see my arrows. So now changing to distribution and transport, I'm going not to talk much about that, because I think you will have also a course of training next week or in the coming weeks about the distribution and transport. So just generally speaking, the compendium, we think of very simple distribution measures, for example, carrying water with a jerry can or small cart. We talk about water trucking, as well as selling water in water kiosks. This is more the decentralized options. And of course, a very important point is distribution systems. So different types of distribution systems, from very small community systems, which are rather this branched type of systems, to more complex loop networks. So which are usually convenient and desired. They have lower level of contamination compared, for example, to this manual transport of water. So if you have a storage tanks as a part of the distribution network, usually that can compensate for some variations on the need and demand of the system. So sometimes also there are pumps which are able to regulate the system without a storage tank, but this is less common. So I think the most important thing to know about distribution systems, it's a lot of engineering. So it's complicated systems. You need to know understand the hydraulic design to be able to kind of plan this kind of system. So you need to find ways of minimize microbial contamination and design basically standpots which are sufficient for filling sufficient amount of vessels if you don't distribute to household level. So another point we need to consider is usually the leakage and wastage of water in distribution systems can be extremely high. So in the Europe context, this is between 10–15% in the very best case. Usually the wastage leakage is over 20%, sometimes even up to 50%. And in some places, for example, like Lagos in Nigeria, 90% of water supplied to distribution network is being wasted in a distribution network. I think another point of the distribution systems is storage tanks, which are really important for emergency context as well. But since now we don't have so much time, I'm not going to go too much detail into that. And I hope that will be covered in the following module. So now we are coming over almost to an end, thinking about the household treatment and safe storage. So I know that in very often this is not considered as like a valuable option for example, refugee camps, but it's coming more and more that the safety of the households has to be considered. And to know why, we have to think how the water can become unsafe at the household. So, and I think very common ways is that while collecting water, the dirty hands can be digged into water. There's jerry cans with missing lids where contamination can come from above. The jerry cans themselves can be very dirty. The animals or dipping hands or items in the containers can lead to contamination. And finally, the insects or dirty caps which are being stored somewhere or even used to fetch the water. So from the container, can be a big problem. This means that if water is supplied to household is safe, it might become unsafe while it has been obstructed at the borehole or at the tanker track. So, and become contaminated while delivered at home. Even if there is some residual chlorine in the water, so it might help for some time, but if the water is stored for long term at the household and obtained not very regularly, so these problems will occur even if the water has been chlorinated. In this case, it's important to assure that there are safe water storage containers in households. Also, Sphere has some standards on the safe water storage at the household level. And generally, we can consider the safe water storage containers being those which have a lid, so which are being closed. If possible, they should have a top or just a narrow opening where the water can be abstracted. So the open containers without lids are considered as not safe storage containers, so unsafe storage containers, and should not be used in households whenever possible. If the water which is provided to households is contaminated, or if it becomes contaminated, in certain conditions, especially if you're thinking about rural areas where the water is being taken from unprotected water sources by households, and financially or from other reasons, it might not be possible to install a more community water supply kind of network system. So you might think of different ways of household water treatment. And I think the most common and very well accepted by households in many areas is the systems for filtration of water. For example, using as biosand filtration, ceramic filtration filters, or membrane filtration filters, which are also available, or being used sometimes in emergencies by organizations. Sometimes they're also distributed as a part of this hygiene packages delivered by some of the international organizations. So another common way is distributing the chlorine pills or chlorine liquid, which can be added to households. It's being done very often in terms of emergencies, but should not just in terms of epidemics during emergencies, but might not be done just during epidemics, but also after that. So the other ways could be UV systems which are available, or for example, thermal ways like cooking water or using solar cookers to pasteurize the water. There's also a very nice course in household water treatment available for free. So if you're interested in these different options and technologies which are there, then I will share also a link at the end where you can watch this open lectures on household water treatment. And while completing talking about water systems, about our six functional groups, I would just like to remind that the drainage and grey water management should never be forgotten when we build a new water supply systems. So this kind of a typical carton which we find in many cases where the drinking water is being thought about, but drainage not, or sorry, about grey water treatment not. So ending up with a big environmental and also health problems around the areas. And if you want to know more about the surface water management and the drainage for field practitioners for humanitarian condition-specific focus on refugee camps, then you can find this very nice manual developed by Humanitarian Innovation Fund and ELRHA. So, and here's a link to that, so where you can find a lot of guidelines and information, practical information on surface water management and drainage. So the last point I would like to mention very shortly is about the water safety. So, and also Sphere handbook mentions that it's not just sufficient kind of to provide water, but we need to assure the water safety in the long term. So basically we need to have some kind of risk assessment of the water chain from water source to the drinking water storage container, basically, and consumer. And the way the sphere supposes to do it in a humanitarian emergency context is that it can be done through sanitary surveys, observation of use of separate containers for water collection and storage, observation of clean or covered drinking water containers, like if that's been used or not, and the water quality testing. So this is kind of basic general minimal requirements to assure that there is really water safety at the household level. But if you're thinking about the water safety of the entire system on a long term, then I would like shortly to mention a water safety network from World Health Organization. This has been introduced first many years ago, so as so-called water safety plans and discussed in guidelines for drinking water quality. And there is also a water safety plan manual available, as well as many more information on W homepage and also this IWA network homepage, where you can find more information to water safety planning. Just very shortly to mention what this water safety planning is. So WHO states this is the most effective means of consistently ensuring the safety of a drinking water supply. So looking at basically the whole system from the source to the consumer, the way how we also introduce it in a compendium. So, and this is a risk-based management system. So it's built around major steps and helps the people who actually manage the system. So this can be the operators or managers like WASH, basically engineers, practitioners in refugee camps, or this can be also community members in a community. So to help them to understand the complete water supply system, identify where and how problems could arise specifically for their system. So not in general, but just really specifically for their context and their system. So trying to put the barriers and management system in place and foresee the problems before they can actually arise. So, and finally, to assure that all of the systems or all parts of the system continue to work properly also on a long term. So this is quite important because the water safety plan sees the problems before they can arise. Usually we know that we like to use the water quality testing as a kind of indicator of water quality. But you know, if you receive the water quality result which is bad, it means that you are already almost 2 days too late, because it usually takes between 24 or 48 hours to receive a water quality test. So in this case, the water safety plans foresee the problems before they can arise and try to stop those problems to happen. So the water safety plans basically has different steps. It's built around 11 steps, and it starts with a preparation, which includes just finding a team or assembling a team, to the system assessment, which focus on the description of the system by people who didn't build the system maybe, but the people who are operating that. So it could be a small community members. So identifying what are the hazards or hazardous events, what kind of risks which hazardous events or hazards can actually cause to the system and how likely it's to happen. So the next step will be to determine and validate the control measures and prioritize the risks. So maybe some of them are not likely to happen, so I should not worry about it at the short scale, but only maybe on the long term. So finally, develop and implement and maintain an improvement and the upgradement plan. So, and going later on into the operational monitoring of the system, where we can see if we can monitor those control measures and verify the effectiveness of them. And finally, the water safety plan addresses the issues related to management communication. So to assure that management procedures are in place and there are also supporting programs for the water safety plans and for the system. And finally, it's important that there is some kind of feedback loop coming back to the system description to see if there are things changed, if the risk or maybe hazards have been changed. So, and in case there was some incident or accident with the water supply system, what has caused it, to be able to implement this again in a water safety plan. So that sounds a little bit complicated, but if you still have a little bit of time, I would just like to show you a 5-minute video, an example from Tajikistan, where a small community basically implemented a water supply, like a water safety plan for their water supply system. Shown that it's actually not very complicated, and it's about the things we might as engineers think about very much, but it gives a possibility of community to understand the system and actually take care that the system is functional. So I'm changing again to this video. Internet connection issue. I don't know why. Hope it works now.
بیماری‌های سرایت کننده در قشت‌ها چند مراتبه شد، لیکن ما از سببی که تا در سمینار اشتراک نکردیم اساس نفهمیدیم که کافتکا کرده، فهمیدیم که اساسی که قشت‌ها اپیدمی آمدگی از حساب همین آب بوده است. وقتی در باران‌های بهار و ژالا دیگر وقتی خطر میشد، هفته‌ها قطعی مردم ما بی آب بودند. وقتی در حالت بی آب بودند از دریا از دیگر کوبرها آب می نوشیدند. در حالت همون آب می نوشیده و مردم به کسلی ها دچار می شدند.
فرزندان باید که عذاب نکشند. گفته همچون آموزگار و همچون زنی موافقی نقشه تأمین به خطر آمد استعمال کرده کسان شمید. و ضمن این در مؤسسه با خوانندگان همیشه فرمانده میمانیم که آن آبی که به ما آمده رسیده است از آن آب درست استفاده برند.
من در این ساحه تامین بهتری آب همچون میرام شده کنم. مقصد تازگیش و ورزش و اخیرا قربان نباشد. من مخصوص ما که برای آبچین کنی داریم که برای اینکه آب مقصد تازگی باید که ورزش هست. اگر نشین میکنید مقصد آب تازگیش تا چند متر سانتیمتر همه آبش تازه تو چقدر خنکی آب است اما ما چند کرده.
نقشه تأمین به خطر آب نقشه یک اصول ارزان ساده می باشد که من می توانم همچون زنی دهه به دیگر محل ها رفته همین نقشه را به آنها فهمانده دهم که از این نقشه آنها استفاده برند. ما سیستم کوزه را به جا آوردیم و بعدا از پس اصلاحی کار شدیم که مقصد آبی از نو آب بیاریم.
ما توانستیم نقشه به خطری آب را در دهه خود جاری نماییم و شما هم می توانید در دهه خود نقشه به خطری آب را جاری نمایید.
Yes, so you have seen just a very like example from a small community, basically showing that how the community can be empowered to be able to manage and improve their water system on their own. So of course it was done with the support of WHO, which conducts a lot of trainings at the moment in the Tajikistan area, so general and Central Asia, and they have a lot of materials on water supply plan training, and there will be also link, or there's also a link to that at the homepage of the WHO. So now I just would like to finalize this course, or this lecture. So, and just to provide a short summary. So basically what we talked about in the beginning were the water-related diseases and link between water and health. We discussed about the sphere standards and their relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, 6 requirements and standards and guidelines. So we looked at the compendium of water treatment or water supply and treatment, and at the different, basically different functional groups of this presented in this compendium, showing that water supply system is a combination of technologies from 6 functional groups. And finally, I introduced very shortly you to the water safety framework from WHO. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you very much.
Marina, thank you very much for your extremely interesting presentation. It's obviously an immense quantity of information, and of course 1 hour for this type of information is really not enough. That's why I'm really looking forward to see this book online, and this will help me, but as well a lot of engineers on the field in Syria to find the interesting link to the technologies and to the right answer to their question that they have in terms of water supply. Currently, as you might know, in Syria, most of our IDP sites are doing water trucking. This is not sustainable solution. We know
Andrea,
that.
I'm
yes?
sorry, Andrea, your voice is a little bit low for me.
Okay, I try to speak louder. So
Okay, thank you.
Now it's better like that. I'm shouting.
Not much different, but it's okay.
Okay, no, that Marina, it's very clear that all the big amount of information you have given, it's impossible to present it in 1 hour. It is too much, but I think it's very important for our technicians and for our engineers to have at least once what they should consider whenever they think about water supply on the field. Through your presentation, you have touched, I would say, all the points that are essential to consider while developing a water supply process. And I'm looking forward to see this compendium online very soon next year. As you might know, now in Syria, most of our IDP sites are doing water trucking, which is totally not sustainable. And for sure, in the future, this non-sustainable water supply system has to be changed into more sustainable system. That's why I think your input is of essential importance. And I also hope that this compendium is going to be translated in Arabic. And once it is done, I will be the first person to distribute it to all the engineers working in the area. Since there are few participants, I do not expect any question, but I really, really thank you a lot for your time, for your very good presentation. And I apologize again for the short time we give you for that.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it as well. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer now or also later, at any later stage, you can contact me also by email.
And if someone would like to have this compendium, even if it's not officially published, this person could just contact me. I might distribute to you as a private, let's say, level, the draft of the compendium, which do not have to be distributed for the time being. And thank you very much again. And thank you very much, Mais, as well, for your translation. This webinar will be published very soon on the YouTube, Arabic and English version. Thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks for saying.
Goodbye.